A toddler sees another child crying across the room. There's no adult prompting her, no explanation offered. She walks over, gently places her toy in the child's lap, and sits beside them quietly, patiently offering not words, but presence. She doesn't yet have language for what she's doing. There's no logic behind her gesture, no cost-benefit analysis. It's instinct. Something in her brain recognizes the distress of another and responds, not with avoidance, but with comfort. In that moment, something ancient is unfolding, something older than thought, empathy. But where does this impulse come from? Why do we feel the pain of others as if it were our own? On the surface, empathy seems irrational, counterproductive. Even from an evolutionary standpoint, natural selection favors traits that improve individual survival and reproduction. So why would evolution select for a trait that makes us emotionally vulnerable, that burdens us with the suffering of others? Wouldn't it make more sense for our brains to prioritize detachment, efficiency, self-interest? And yet, biology tells a different story. Across species, from elephants mourning their dead to rats freeing caged companions. Instead of choosing food, empathy shows up again and again. Neuroscientists have identified mirror neurons in primates and humans that fire not only when we act, but when we witness someone else act, especially in pain or distress. MRI scans reveal that when we see someone else suffer, the pain centers in our own brains light up, too. The line between self and other, biologically speaking, is far more porous than we like to admit. So maybe empathy isn't a flaw in the system. Maybe it's not an accident or a luxury we can afford only in times of peace. What if it's the opposite? What if empathy is a survival mechanism, a deeply embedded biological function that allowed early humans to cooperate, care for the injured, and form the social bonds that made complex civilization possible? Philosophically, this reframes everything. Empathy is often viewed as soft, as optional, as morally virtuous but biologically inefficient. But what if it evolved not in spite of the brutal pressures of survival, but because of them? What if our ability to feel for others, our pain at their suffering, our joy at their relief, is not weakness at all, but one of the strongest traits we possess? The toddler doesn't know any of this. She doesn't need to. Her body already does. Empathy, as we understand it today, may seem like a modern virtue tied to moral philosophy, emotional intelligence, or social harmony, but its roots stretch far deeper into the very structure of evolutionary biology. Charles Darwin, often associated more with competition than compassion, proposed something striking in The Descent of Man. He suggested that sympathy's term for the early form of empathy was not a weakness, but a critical part of moral instinct. In the early chapters of human evolution, when survival was harsh and uncertain, brute strength alone wasn't enough. What allowed early hominin groups to flourish was mutual care, mothers protecting offspring, tribes defending their injured, and shared emotional responses that helped bind communities together. Survival wasn't just about self-preservation, it was about connection. This biological basis for empathy gained striking support in the 1990s, when neuroscientists studying macaque monkeys stumbled upon an unexpected discovery: mirror neurons. These are brain cells that activate both when an animal performs an action and when it sees another perform the same action. If a monkey reaches for a peanut, certain neurons fire. But those same neurons fire when the monkey simply watches another do it. This perceptual emotional mirroring wasn't limited to motor skills, it extended to pain, fear, and emotion. And similar neurons have since been found in humans, birds, and other animals, suggesting that empathy is deeply embedded in our nervous systems. Our brains are wired not only to understand others cognitively, but to feel with them. It's not just metaphor when we say we feel someone's pain, it's measurable biology. In today's world, empathy continues to shape our daily lives in invisible but profound ways. It drives parenting, the attunement of a caregiver to a baby's cries. It governs medicine, where a doctor's capacity to emotionally connect can influence healing outcomes. It's woven into law, education, therapy, and even entertainment. Stories that move us do so because they activate the same neural pathways as real experience. Our ability to care about fictional characters or faraway strangers in a news story is the same circuitry that once helped our ancestors nurture their wounded, share food, or mourn the dead. And yet, in the hyper-connected digital age, empathy is under unprecedented pressure. Social media platforms reward outrage over understanding. Algorithms amplify conflict and numb emotional resonance through endless scrolling. Constant exposure to suffering, from global tragedies to local conflicts, can lead to compassion fatigue. We begin to protect ourselves by disconnecting. The same empathic systems designed to foster closeness now risk being overwhelmed. Ironically, we're surrounded by more information than ever, but maybe feeling less. This raises a crucial question. Are we evolving away from empathy? Or are we simply in a moment of adaptive crisis where the ancient mechanisms of emotional connection must be reimagined for the complexities of a globalized, digitized world? If empathy once helped us survive on the savannah, can it help us survive now amid climate change, political polarization, and growing social fragmentation? What happens to our biology, our culture, and our humanity if we begin to lose the ability to feel for one another? The stakes are not abstract. They are deeply personal and urgently collective. In a world that moves faster than the nervous system was designed for, our capacity for empathy may be the most endangered and essential adaptation we have. In 2006, a quiet but revolutionary experiment reshaped how scientists think about empathy. In a laboratory setting, researchers observed rats faced with a peculiar dilemma. One rat was free to roam, while its cagemate was trapped in a small enclosure. There was no incentive offered, no food, no social reward. And yet, time after time, the free rat worked diligently to release its distressed companion. The behavior was not driven by gain, but by something else entirely, a drive to alleviate another's suffering. But here's where it gets more complicated. When the helping rat had no previous exposure to being trapped itself, it was far less likely to offer aid. In other words, the capacity for empathic action seemed to depend on a kind of personal resonance, shared memory of suffering. Without that shared experience, empathy weakened. This discovery opened a profound dilemma. Empathy, long believed to be an innate and universal trait, turns out to be deeply contextual. It's not a reflexive moral instinct that applies to all equally. It's filtered through identity, memory, and familiarity. We are more likely to empathize with those who resemble us biologically, culturally, emotionally. Our mirror neurons tune more readily to faces we recognize, voices we relate to, pain we have personally known. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Early human tribes were small, tightly bonded units, and survival often depended on prioritizing the needs of kin and in-group members. But in a modern, interconnected world, this selective empathy reveals a dangerous shadow. The contradiction is glaring. Empathy may be hardwired into our brains, but it's also narrow. It excludes, it biases, it falters at the borders of race, class, nationality, and lived experience. We care most when the suffering is close, when it feels like our own. But what does that mean for a global society that demands inclusion, justice, and shared responsibility? How do we build moral systems on a neurological foundation that is, by nature, partial and preferential? This is where the ethical crisis of empathy begins to emerge. If our brains are wired to care more about people who look, sound, or live like us, how do we train ourselves to care beyond those boundaries? How do we expand the emotional architecture of the brain to include the stranger, the foreigner, the one whose pain we have never felt? Can empathy evolve, just biologically, but culturally, morally, collectively? Because if empathy is what connects us, then selective empathy is what divides us. And without awareness, that division can seep into everything from criminal justice to education to medicine to policy. The challenge, then, is not just to feel empathy, but to interrogate it, to ask, who do I extend it to instinctively? Who do I withhold it from unconsciously? And how do I begin to widen the circle? This is not a small task. It requires us to go against the grain of what evolution optimized for. But perhaps the future of empathy lies not in its automatic response, but in its conscious expansion. Not in what we feel naturally, but in what we choose to feel deliberately. That choice may be the next great leap in human development, not driven by survival alone, but by something higher, the decision to care beyond the self. The story of empathy is not a modern invention, it's as old as humanity itself. Archaeological evidence from ancient burial sites tells a story written in bone and care. In early hunter-gatherer societies, individuals with severe disabilities, spinal deformities, paralysis, blindness, were not abandoned. They were fed, protected, and tended to, sometimes for years, long past the point of evolutionary usefulness. This wasn't rational or efficient. It was emotional. It was human. These ancient remains are silent testaments to something extraordinary. Empathy was embedded in culture long before it was ever studied in a lab. The instinct to care, to carry one another, was not a deviation from survival. It was how survival happened. But empathy has always walked a double-edged path. Just as it binds us to those we love, it can blind us to those we don't. Empathy is selective by nature, more likely to arise for those we see as part of our group. History is full of chilling examples. Nazi soldiers sang lullabies to their own children, protected their neighbors, even adored their pets while participating in horrific atrocities against those they viewed as outsiders. Their empathy wasn't absent, it was contained, directed inward toward the familiar, weaponized by ideology to justify the denial of humanity in others. This is the dark side of empathy, its tendency to divide as much as it unites. Psychology reveals a sobering pattern. People often feel deeper empathy for one identifiable victim, a single child, a specific face, than for large groups suffering. In abstraction, this is called compassion collapse. Our brains evolved in small communities where every face mattered. Today, faced with mass suffering on screens and headlines, the emotional circuits short-circuit. We shut down. We scroll past, not because we don't care, but because we can't process that much pain without breaking. The anterior insular and anterior cingulate cortex regions of the brain responsible for pain sharing and empathic resonance scan only carries so much. When they're overactivated without resolution or action, the system protects itself by numbing out. This is empathy fatigue. Modern neuroscience has begun to take this seriously. In healthcare, humanitarian work, and therapy, professionals exposed to constant suffering often report emotional blunting, not because they're callous, but because their brains are overwhelmed. Empathy becomes painful, unsustainable, even toxic. Some researchers now argue that empathy alone is not enough. It must be paired with compassionate action, deliberate, thoughtful responses that don't rely solely on emotional resonance. This is where cognitive empathy, understanding another's experience, can step in to guide behavior even when emotional resources are depleted. This brings us to a difficult but essential question. Can empathy scale? Can a brain built for villages respond morally in a world of 8 billion? If empathy is selective, fragile, and sometimes paralyzing, how do we build systems of justice, equity, and care that don't collapse under its weight. Philosophers and ethicists suggest a powerful reframing. Empathy should not be the basis of morality, but its ignition. It gets us to notice. But reason, principle, and deliberate action must carry it forward. We may not feel deeply for every stranger, but we can design laws, institutions, and cultures that uphold dignity regardless of feeling. Empathy, then, becomes the spark knot, the fuel of ethical society. This is the central conflict of our time. Whether our emotional systems can evolve fast enough to meet the moral demands of a global world. Empathy remains one of our most beautiful capacities, but left unchecked, it can be biased, blinkered, and brittle. The challenge now is not to discard empathy, but to deepen it, to train it, to pair it with wisdom, accountability, and design. Because caring is not enough, we must care well, and that, in the end, may be empathy's most important evolution. For decades, empathy was treated as a singular thinker, fixed personality trait, either possessed or not. But the deeper scientists probed into the brain, the more nuanced the picture became. Empathy, it turns out, isn't one ability. It's a modular system composed of distinct but interconnected parts. First, there's affective empathy, the capacity to feel another's emotions as if they were your own. This is the raw, visceral reaction when you see someone cry and feel tears well in your own eyes. Then there's cognitive empathy, the ability to understand what someone else is thinking or feeling, even if you don't share the emotion. It's perspective-taking theory of mind. And finally, there's compassionate empathy, the drive to act, to alleviate suffering, to turn emotion into response. These components can function together or separately. A skilled manipulator might have high cognitive empathy, intuitively grasping what others feel, but no compassionate drive. A deeply sensitive person might feel affective empathy so intensely that they shut down, unable to help. Empathy, in this new light, isn't a monolith. It's a dynamic, trainable system. And that may be the most hopeful revelation of all. Because what once seemed like a fixed moral capacity, something you either had or didn't, can be developed. Mindfulness training has been shown to strengthen the insular and anterior cingulate cortex, key hubs in the empathy network. Practices like loving-kindness, meditation, increase compassionate responses, even towards strangers or adversaries. Narrative immersion, reading novels, watching character-driven stories, empathy circuits in much the same way real life interaction does. Remarkably, people who engage in regular empathy training show measurable changes in their brains, thicker cortical areas associated with social cognition, stronger connectivity between emotional and regulatory networks, and even improved autonomic nervous system flexibility. In short, empathy can grow, but not everyone starts from the same place. Genetic research reveals intriguing differences in baseline empathic capacity. One gene, in particular OXTR, which codes for the oxytocin receptor, has been linked to individual differences in empathy, trust, and social bonding. Certain variants seem to make people more naturally attuned to others' emotions. But genetics isn't destined its potential. A person with a high empathy variant raised in a cold or traumatic environment may shut down those circuits for survival. Conversely, someone with a less sensitive genetic profile may, in the right environment, learn deep compassion through modeling, care, and connection. Nature loads the gun, but nurture aims it. And here lies the deeper realization. Empathy didn't just evolve to help humans survive threats. It evolved to help us build meaning, connection, story. Empathy is the neurological bridge that allows two beings to inhabit a shared emotional space, to echo each other's joys and sorrows. It is the root of everything we hold sacred: art, love, justice, belonging. When we lose empathy, when we let it shrink under the weight of fear, division, or exhaustion, we don't just become less moral, we become less human. Empathy isn't an accessory to civilization, it is its architecture. To live without empathy is to live in a world where other people are merely data points, predictable but not felt, where pain becomes tolerable if it's far away, where suffering doesn't ripple across the skin of shared experience. But when empathy is cultivated intentionally, relentlessly, it transforms not just the individual, but the collective. It widens the definition of us. It dismantles apathy. It moves people toward one another, again and again, in defiance of entropy. In the end, empathy is not weakness. It is not sentimentality. It is a form of intelligence, the wisdom of the nervous system recognizing itself in another. And to feel deeply, to act kindly, to care for what is not your own is not only a gift, it is the future of being human. Today's science reveals something profound. Empathy is not just a moral virtue, it is a biological force with measurable power. Studies show that when we engage empathically, the brain releases oxytocin, which not only fosters trust and bonding, but also enhances immune function and reduces levels of cortisol, the stress hormone. In classrooms, empathetic teachers create psychologically safe environments that boost learning, emotional regulation, and academic resilience. In hospitals, patients of empathetic doctors show faster recovery rates, report less pain, and experience greater adherence to treatment plans. These aren't abstract values, they are concrete, physiological outcomes rooted in the way our bodies respond to being seen, heard, and emotionally held. Empathy is not limited to individual interactions, has societal implications as well. In prison systems, programs that teach emotional recognition, active listening, and perspective-taking have led to reduced rates of reoffending. In Rwanda, after the 1994 genocide, government and community leaders turned to storytelling circles and forgiveness rituals, not to erase trauma, but to survivors and perpetrators alike participated in structured dialogues that engaged not only logic, but emotion. The process didn't rely on courtroom justice alone. It leaned heavily on the power of shared feeling, on empathy as a scaffold for societal repair. Modern neuroscience has begun to identify specific practices that reliably grow empathy. Storytelling, for instance, especially through novels and films, activates neural coupling between the storyteller and the listener, synchronizing their brain activity and creating emotional resonance. Regular perspective-taking, imagining a situation from another person's point of view, strengthen the medial prefrontal cortex, an area essential for theory of mind and empathic reasoning. Even seemingly unrelated habits, like gratitude, journaling, or exposure to different social groups, have been shown to stimulate empathic pathways by softening fear circuits and enhancing recognition of shared humanity. What all of this points to is a radical reframing. Empathy is not soft. It is not a sentimental luxury, nor a trait reserved for idealists or dreamers. Empathy is a power tool, biological, cognitive, and cultural. It rewires the brain, reshapes the body, and reorders the social fabric. It helps individuals recover, relationships repair, and societies rebuild. And it's not something we either have or don't. It's something we practice, something we build, like a muscle, through story, through care, through intentional acts of understanding. In a world that often rewards detachment and efficiency, empathy asks us to slow down, to feel more, not less. And in doing so, it doesn't make us weaker. It makes us stronger, more resilient, more connected, and more capable of shaping a future where healing is possible, not just for individuals, but for entire communities. Empathy, in this light, isn't a response to suffering. It's the beginning of its transformation, A hospice nurse sits quietly beside a dying man she met only hours earlier. His breathing is shallow, his words are few. He doesn't ask for solutions, and she doesn't offer any. She simply takes his hand, a small human gesture in a room filled with silence and finality. He looks at her, not with fear, but with something. Softer recognition. She doesn't speak, but her presence says everything. I'm here. I see you. I feel this with you. And in that moment, the man smiles, not because anything has changed, not because his pain has disappeared, but because, for the first time in a long time, he is not alone in it. Empathy doesn't fix the world. It doesn't reverse tragedy, undo betrayal, or erase injustice. It's not the grand solution to every problem we face, but it might be the beginning of every real solution we've ever found. Because before any change happens, before healing, justice, or peace, someone must be willing to feel what another feels, to bear witness, to sit in the dark with someone else and say, without judgment or fear, I'm here too. That is where connection begins. That is where resilience grows. That is where the future, however fragile, starts to take shape. The evolution of empathy is more than a neurological trick or a social adaptation. It is a record of what we've chosen to become. We are not the strongest species. We are not the fastest or the fiercest, but we are the ones who stop, who reach out, who grieve each other's grief and celebrate each other's joy. We are the ones who, across distance and difference, can choose to care. And in that choice, in that soft, stubborn act of feeling for another, we become something more than survival machines. We become human, and maybe, in the end, that's what empathy really is. Not just the story of how we endured, but the story of how we loved, how we lived, how we might still, even now, find our way back to each other.